So like many others out there, I've recently gotten into the Book of Boba Fett on Disney+. This, along with the Guardians of the Galaxy game and the newer season of The Expanse, has really got me on a sci-fi kick, leading to the purchase of some Star Wars Legion miniatures and some 3D models from Skullforge Studios. After 3D printing a bit of terrain, I decided it was time that I had a go at a sci-fi building of my own. So I started off with a box. I got this from Bunnings to keep some spray paint in as I left, and it just seemed like a nice weird shape. After this, I went to my scraps bin and grabbed anything that looked like it had an interesting shape. The first attachment would be this paper towel roll to make for a nice tower up the side of the building. So I traced out the edge and cut out a section for it to fit into. Next up was this piece of plastic from a hard drive. I thought it would make for a good door, so I cut away the base and any extra, and then cut it into the front part of the building. Once I had this in a nice interesting shape that I liked, I glued everything down with a hot glue gun. I wasn't too careful with the glue because I knew that I'd cover this all up later on with the end finish. I took the second half of the plastic container and stuck it to the top, and then found this lid from a washing detergent that happened to fit perfectly. I just keep adding shapes until I'm happy with a different sci-fi feel to the building. Again, hot gluing everything in place, not worrying about being too messy as it's going to all be covered up with the sandy finish. Next up, I wanted to make a little balcony, so I used some sprue and poked it into the cardboard before gluing it in place. Then cutting off some more sprue to use as a bit of a scaffolding to hold up the balcony. While my original plan was to use cardboard for these bases, I found these failed 3D prints of mine that had an interesting texture due to the supports inside the print. This happened to fit perfectly, so I glued this down and decided to use a second piece for the roof. I ended up using another piece for the garage door style entry on the side of the building, before coming in with some more of the sprue to create a scaffolding around the extruding edges of the platform. Next up, I went to my bits box and started to find some Greeblies. A Greebly is essentially a detailing added to the outside of a bigger model to help add a little bit of extra detail and scaling to the piece. These all come from a 3D printer for me, but classically you can pull these from old model kits. In this case, this piece here is an old piece of Lego and a couple of cocktail straws, proving that you don't actually need any proper kits at all. You can just make a lot of this stuff from things you find around the house. I just so happen to have a 3D printer, so I do use quite a few 3D printed Greeblies to help bring everything to scale on this build. I'm using these as some pipes around the edges, and I'm going to use the heat from the hot glue gun to help bend the plastic and glue it into some holes that I punched in the cardboard, before coming back in and fixing up the supports on the roof piece to make sure that everything fits in snugly, before adding in some glue to hold everything in place. Now that I've got everything where I want it, I mix up some white gesso with some cement-based grout and some coloured sand. I would probably recommend not adding the sand, as the texture and grit was a little bit higher than I like. On one of my next builds, I'm going to use a similar recipe without the sand, and I think it turned out much better. Once you're at a good viscosity, it's time to take that mix and apply it to the base of your building, anywhere that you want it to look like a classic sandy render of a Tatooine building. Once it's all covered up, it's time to add on a few Greeblies. I realised that I should give this tower a coat of Mod Podge, largely to seal it up, but also just to help give it a more metallic sheen. After a couple of heavy coats of Mod Podge, I can use this to help stick a few of the extra vents onto the side of this large tower. Also adding a hatch for it to be accessed, and some matching vents on the other side, before going around to the front of the building and adding a few little vents and computer systems, and a special rooftop access to make sure that all these other vents and bits and pieces are working just fine. Adding on these Greeblies is the final part of the process, before taking it outside to dry, and then hitting it with a layer of the Fiddly Bits grey primer from Bunnings. When you're kit bashing a model like this, the layer of grey primer really helps to take what looked like some piece of garbage and help you realise that final design. And once that's dry, I came in with a layer of ZANDARI dust by Citadel. I'm using this for my desert sand render. Doing my best effort to keep this onto the areas of rendered gesso and away from any of the plastic areas that I want to leave as a metal later on. Now that the rough colours are in, it's time to get down to details. I come in with a lot of the Citadel base colour LEADBELCHER. This is a great base metal that really gives everything a good, heavy, thick coat. I hit all of the parts that I intended to be metal, including all of the smaller Greeblies and the large tower. Doing my best effort not to get silver all over the render, although I do plan on coming in later and touching all of the rendered edges up with a Citadel base of ZANDARI dust. Next up, I came in on some of the other Greeblies with a black Templar contrast paint from Citadel, before doing a layer of ABADON black over all of the larger metal walkways and balconies, as well as the garage door on the side of the building. Now it's time to come back in with the base colour of ZANDARI dust to hit anywhere that I may have missed with the spray paint that ran out, and to fix up any of the edges that I messed up on the details. Next up, I spray the top of the tower with a metallic spray paint and slide it back into place, before adding a few more metallic details and Greeblies around the place with a little bit of super glue to hold everything where it needs to be. Some small gauge pieces of wire really do the trick for pieces of wire. They can just be a little bit difficult to hold in place even with the super glue, so you might want to make sure to punch a few holes to push the edges in, and then add the super glue to help hold everything in place. Now I found these brilliant doors on Thingiverse, so I printed out a few on my Elegoo Mars printer and then sprayed them all with a Fiddly Bits grey primer from Bunnings. This stuff costs a couple of bucks and works great. And sticking with the cheap paints, I came in with a flat black from a $2 shop. And once that was dry, I gave the whole thing a dry brush in the basic Citadel LEADBELCHER that I've used for the rest of this build. While I was there, I used the same LEADBELCHER colour to dry brush on some extra texture onto the rest of these black platforms. And doing the same to a few of those Greeblies that I painted in the Templar black earlier on. Now to add the doors, I found that I was going to have to sand back these areas a little bit because the larger pieces of sand stuck out and made them sit unevenly. Once I'd cleaned this up, I used some super glue and stuck the doors in place. One on the upper level to the balcony and one on the main front of the building, repeating the process of sanding back the area for this door as well. Sanding back the grout, adding a big pile of super glue and then sticking it in place. Now that everything was where it should be, it was time to come in with some Nuln oil and add a little bit of aging and weathering to all of the metal pieces and Greeblies around this build. This helps to fill in the shadow and bring all those tiny little details to life. Next up, I come in with an Agrax Earthshade to add a bit of a dirty, oily spill coming out and leaking from all of the vents, helping to add that dirty sci-fi grungy look that Star Wars is known for. Before adding on a few little extra Greeblies of some security cameras by all of our entrances, just to help add something extra to any kind of roleplay situation this can be used for, and a tiny little control panel, which I painted with some ABADON black, and then did the buttons in a Cantor blue, Flash Gits yellow, and Mephiston red, before gluing this tiny control panel onto the side of the door. Now moving over to the 3D printer, where we're printing out some handrails to go on those rooftop and balconies. It's all about OH&S on Tatooine. Once these were done, I pulled them off the printer and gave them a heavy black spray paint, before making sure that all of my measurements had fit perfectly and trimming off the extra bits and pieces that I decided I didn't need. Now with one last dry fit, I add some glue to the base and then to the handrail and stick everything in place. So that I don't have to hold this for hours, I hit it all with a super glue accelerant just to help hold it in place before continuing on to the next guardrail. Going over the same process again and again, making sure to get every single section of this nice and safe for the inspector. As I go, I pull out some steps that I 3D printed off a Star Wars Legion kit that I found on Thingiverse and trim these down to fit fairly accurately before adding a few more guardrails to come right up to the proper edges. Once I have all these nice and stable, I add the second set of stairs, bringing me up to the middle row, and off camera I added in another platform. Painting all of the steps with a black Templar contrast paint, making sure to get right into all of the edges and undersides, before adding in one last little piece of platform to help add a top to this step. Off camera, I added on a few extra Greeblies. I then grabbed a LEADBELCHER base silver from Citadel to colour these up. I continue to use my partially dried brush after this to dry brush some extra silver highlights onto all of the black sections of metal that I'd done earlier, before coming in with a Citadel bronze colour to really highlight some of these extra Greeblies. And since I'd added on an extra platform, I had to go back to the 3D printer and print out another batch of handrails. It was rather late at night, but I still decided that I wanted to get this done, so I hit them with a very heavy layer of the black paint and give them about a half an hour to dry before I bring them inside, check that they fit properly, and trim them down to size. As I did previously, I do a quick dry fit, add the glue, place the piece where I want it, and give it a spray with a glue accelerant to hold everything in place, before continuing on to all of the other edges of this platform. Making sure to really get into all these edges and tiny little parts to really add in that extra detail. Now that's all done, it's time to check that the models fit. And it looks like they're safe and can even walk up these staircases. I'm pretty happy with how this is so far. So after pulling off a few little bits of mess and using a cheap black acrylic paint to touch up all these areas where I had trimmed off the 3D prints, this model was ready. Yeah, I think we can do a little bit better to show it off than that. I'm pretty happy with how this went for my first sci-fi build. I'm going to be using a lot of these methods in one of my coming up builds where I'm going to be making a diorama for the Book of Boba Fett using these awesome 3D models from Skullforge Studios.